Day 9, Zinj, June 21st, 1979. 1. Tiger Tail. Their entrance into the lost city of Zinj on the morning of June 21st was accomplished with none of the mystery and romance of 19th century accounts of similar journeys. These 20th century explorers sweated and grunted under a burdensome load of technical equipment, optical rangefinders, data log compasses, RF directionals with attached transmitters, and microwave transponders, all deemed essential to the modern high-speed evaluation of a ruined archaeological site. They were only interested in diamonds. Screeman had been only interested in gold when he excavated Troy, and he had devoted 3 years to it. Was expected to find her diamonds in 3 days. According to the Earth's computer simulation, the best way to do this was to draw up a ground plan of the city. With the plan in hand, it would be relatively simple to deduce mine locations from the arrangement of urban structures. They expected a usable plan of the city within 6 hours. Using RF transponders, they had only to stand in each of the 4 corners of a building, pressing the radio beeper at each corner. Back in camp, 2 widely spaced receivers recorded their signals, so that their computer could plot them in 2 dimensions. But the ruins were extensive, covering more than 3 square kilometers. A radio survey would separate them widely in dense foliage, and considering what had happened to the previous expedition, this seemed unwise. Their alternative was what Ertz called the non-systematic survey, or the tiger tail approach. It was a joke at Ertz that one way to find a tiger was to keep walking until you stepped on its tail. They moved through the ruined buildings, avoiding the slithering snakes and giant spiders that scurried into the dark recesses. The spiders were the size of a man's hand, and to Ross's astonishment, made a loud clicking noise. They noticed that the stonework was of excellent quality, although the limestone in many places was pitted and crumbling. And everywhere they saw the half-moon curve of doors and windows, which seemed to be cultural design motif. But aside from that curved shape, they found almost nothing distinctive about the rooms they passed through. In general, the rooms were rectangular and roughly the same size. The walls were bare, lacking decoration. After so many intervening centuries, they found no artifacts at all, although Elliot finally came upon a pair of disc-shaped stone paddles, which they presumed had been used to grind spices or grain. The bland, characterless quality of the city grew more disturbing as they continued. It was also inconvenient, since they had no way to refer to one place or another. They began assigning arbitrary names to different buildings. When Garen Ross found a series of cubbyholes carved into the wall of one room, she announced that this must be a post office, and from then on it was referred to as the post office. They came upon a row of small rooms, with post holes for wooden bars. Monroe thought these were cells of a jail, but the cells were extremely small. Ross said that perhaps the people were small, or perhaps the cells were intentionally small for punishment. Elliot thought perhaps they were cages for a zoo, but in that case, why were all the cages of the same size? And Monroe pointed out that there was no provisions for viewing the animals. He repeated his conviction that it was a jail. The rooms became known as the jail. Near to the jail, they found an open court they called the gymnasium. It was apparently an athletic field or training ground. There were 4 tall stone stakes with a crumbling stone ring at the top. Evidently, these had been used for some kind of game like tetherball. In a corner of the court stood a horizontal overhead bar, like a jungle gym, no more than 5 feet off the ground. The low bar led Elliot to conclude that this was a playground for children. Ross repeated her belief that the people were small. Monroe wondered if the gymnasium was a training area for soldiers. As they continued their search, they were all aware that their reactions simply mirrored their preoccupations. The city was so neutral, so uninformative, that it became a kind of warsack for them. What they needed was objective information about the people who had built the city and their life. It was there all along, although they were slow to realize it. In many rooms, one wall or another was overgrown with black-green mold. Monroe noticed that this mold did not grow in relation to light from a window, or air currents, or any other factor they could identify. In some rooms, the mold grew thickly, halfway down a wall, only to stop in a sharp horizontal line, as if cut by a knife. "Damn strange," Monroe said, peering at the mold, rubbing his fingers against it. His finger came away with traces of blue paint. That was how they discovered the elaborate bas-reliefs once painted that appeared throughout the city. However, the overgrowth of mold on the irregular carved surface and the pitting of the limestone made any interpretation of the images impossible. After lunch, Monroe mentioned that it was too bad they hadn't brought along a group of art historians to recover the bas-relief images. With all their lights and machines, they could see what's there in no time, he said. The most recent examination techniques for artwork as devised by D'Agusto and others employed infrared light and image intensification, and the Congo expedition had the necessary equipment to contrive such a method on the spot. At least it was worth a try. After lunch, they returned to the ruins, lugging in the video camera, one of the infrared night lights, and the tiny computer display screen. After an hour of fiddling, They had worked out a system by shining infrared light on the walls and recording the images with the video camera, and then feeding that image via a satellite through the digitizing computer programs in Houston, and returning it back to their portable display unit. They were able to reconstitute the pictures on the walls. Seeing the bas reliefs in this way reminded Peter Elliott of the night goggles. If you looked directly at the walls, you saw nothing but dark moss and lichen and pitted stone. But if you looked at the little computer screen, you saw the original painted scenes, vibrant and lifelike. It was, he remembered, very peculiar. There we were in the middle of the jungle, but we could only examine our environment indirectly with the machines. We used goggles to see at night, and video to see during the day. We were using machines to see what we could not see otherwise, and we were totally dependent on them. He also found it odd that the information recorded by the video camera had to travel more than 20,000 miles before returning to the display screen. Only a few feet away. It was, he said later, the world's longest spinal cord, and it produced an odd effect. Even at the speed of light, the transmission required 1/10 of a second, and since there was a short processing time in the Houston computer, the images did not appear on the screen instantaneously, but arrived about half a second late. The delay was just barely noticeable. The scenes they saw provided them with their first insight into the city and its inhabitants. The people of Zinj were relatively tall blacks with round heads and muscular bodies. In appearance, they resembled the Bantu-speaking people who had first entered the Congo from the highland savannas to the north 2,000 years ago. They were depicted here as lively and energetic despite the climate. They favored elaborately decorated, colorful long robes. Their attitudes and gestures were expansive in all ways. They contrasted sharply with the bland and crumbling structures. Now all that remained of their civilization. The first decoded frescoes showed marketplace scenes. Sellers squatted on the ground beside beautiful woven baskets containing round objects, while buyers stood and bargained with them. At first they thought the round objects were fruit, but Ross decided they were stones. "Those are uncut diamonds in a surrounding matrix," she said, staring at the screen. "They're selling diamonds." The frescoes led them to consider what had happened to the inhabitants of the city of Zinj, for the city was clearly abandoned, not destroyed. There was no sign of war or invaders, no evidence of any cataclysm or natural disaster. Whilst voicing her deepest fears, suspected the diamond mines had given out, turning the city into a ghost town, like so many other mining settlements in history. Elliot thought that a plague or disease had overcome the inhabitants. Monroe said he thought the guerrillas were responsible. Don't laugh, he said. This is a volcanic area. Eruptions, earthquakes, drought, fires on the savannah. The animals go berserk and don't behave in the ordinary way at all. Nature on a rampage? Elliot asked, shaking his head. There are volcanic eruptions here every few years, and we know this city existed for centuries. It can't be that. Maybe there was a palace revolution, a coup. What would that matter to gorillas? Elliot laughed. It happens, Monroe said. In Africa, the animals always get strange when there's a war on. You'll know. He then told them stories of baboons attacking farmhouses in South Africa and buses in Ethiopia. Elliot was unimpressed. These ideas of nature mirroring the affairs of man were very old, at least as old as Aesop, and about as scientific. The natural world is indifferent to man, he said. Oh, no question, Monroe said, but there isn't much natural world left. Elliot was reluctant to agree with Monroe, but in fact a well-known academic thesis argued just that. In 1955, the French anthropologist Maurice Cavalli published a controversial paper entitled The Death of Nature. In it he said, 1 million years ago, the earth was characterized by a pervasive wilderness, which we may call nature. In the midst of this wild nature stood small enclaves of human habitation, where the caves were with artificial fire to keep men warm, or later cities with dwellings and artificial fields of cultivation. These enclaves were distinctly unnatural. In the succeeding millennia, the area of untouched nature surrounding artificial human enclaves progressively declined, although for centuries the trend remained invisible. Even 300 years ago, in France or England, the great cities of man were isolated by hectares of wilderness, in which untamed beasts roamed, as they had for thousands of years before. And yet the expansion of man continued inexorably. 100 years ago, in the last days of the great European explorers, nature had so radically diminished that it was a novelty. It is for this reason that African explorations captured the imagination of 19th century man. To enter a truly natural world was exotic, beyond the experience of most mankind, who lived from birth to death in entirely man-made circumstances. In the 20th century, the balance has shifted so far that for all practical purposes, one may say that nature has disappeared. Wild plants are preserved in hothouses, wild animals in zoos and game parks, artificial settings created by man as a souvenir of the once prevalent natural world. But an animal in a zoo or a game park does not live its natural life, any more than a man in a city lives a natural life. Today we are surrounded by man and his creations. Man is inescapable everywhere on the globe, and nature is a fantasy, a dream of the past long gone. Ross called Elliot away from his dinner. It's for you, she said, pointing to the computer next to the antenna. That friend of yours again. Monroe grinned. Even in the jungle, the phone never stops ringing. Elliot went over to look at the screen. Computer language analysis NG required more input. Can provide what input? Elliot typed back. More oral input. Transmit recordings. Elliot typed back. Yes, if occurs. Yes, if occurs. Record frequency 2 to 50,000 cycles. Critical. Elliot typed back. Understood. Understood. There was a pause. Then the screen printed, "How's Amy?" Elliot hesitated. "Fine." "Staff sends love," came the reply. And the transmissions was momentarily interrupted. Hold transmission. There was a long pause. Incredible news. Siemens printed, "Have found MRS Swenson." Swenson NWZ 2. For a moment, Elliot did not recognize the name Swenson. Who was Swenson? A transmission error? And then he realized, Mrs. Swenson, Amy's discoverer, the woman who had brought her from Africa and had donated her to the Minneapolis Zoo. The woman who had been in Borneo all these weeks. If we had only known Amy, mother, not killed by natives. Elliot waited impatiently for the next message from Siemens. Elliot stared at the message. He had always been told that Amy's mother had been killed by natives in a village called Bagimindi. The mother had been killed for food, and Amy was orphaned. What means? Mother already dead, not eaten. The natives hadn't killed Amy's mother. She was already dead. Explain. Swenson has pictured, can transmit. Hastily, Elliot typed, his fingers fumbling at the keyboard. Transmit. There was a pause that seemed interminable, and then the video screen received the transmission, scanning it from the top to bottom, long before the picture filled the screen. Elliot realized what it showed, a crude snapshot of a gorilla corpse, with a crushed skull. The animal lay on its back in a packed earth clearing, presumably in a native village. In that moment, Elliot felt as if the puzzle that preoccupied him, that had caused so much anguish for so many months, was explained. If only they had been able to reach her before. The glowing electronic image faded to black. Elliot was confronted by a rush of sudden questions. Crushed skulls occurred in the remote and supposedly uninhabited region of the Congo, Kanyamagufa, the place of bones. But Bagimindi was a trading village on the Lubula River, more than 100 miles away. How had Amy and her dead mother reached Bagimindi? Well, I said, got a problem? I don't understand the sequence. I need to ask. Before you do, she said, review the transmission. It's all in memory. She pressed a button marked repeat. The earlier transmitted conversation was repeated on the screen. As Elliot watched Siemens' answers, one line struck him. Mother already dead, not eaten. Why wasn't the mother eaten? Gorilla meat was an acceptable, indeed a prized food in this part of the Congo basin. He typed in a question. Why mother not eaten? Mother infant found by natives army but drooled down farm, Sudan carried crops. Infants 5 days to Begemindi village for sale. Tourists. Swenson's there. 5 days? Quickly, Elliot typed the important question. Where found? The answer came back. Unknown area, Congo. Specify. No details. A short pause. Then there's more pictures. Send, he typed back. The screen went blank, and then filled once more, from top to bottom. Now he saw a closer view of the female gorilla's crushed skull, and alongside the huge skull, a small black creature lying on the ground, hands and feet clenched, mouth open in a frozen scream. Amy. Wallace repeated the transmission several times, finishing on the image of Amy as an infant, small, black, screaming. No wonder she's been having nightmares, Ross said. She probably saw her mother killed. Elliot said, well, at least we can be sure it wasn't gorillas. They didn't kill each other. Right now, Ross said, we can't be sure of anything at all. The night of June 21st was so quiet that by 10 o'clock they switched off the infrared nightlights to save power. Almost at once, they became aware of movement in the foliage outside the compound. Monroe and Kahiga strung their guns around. The rustling increased, and they heard an odd sighing sound, a sort of a wheeze. Elliot heard it too, and felt a chill. It was the same wheezing that had been recorded on the tapes from the first Congo expedition. He turned on the tape recorder and swung the microphone around. They were all tense, alert, waiting. But for the next hour, nothing further happened. The foliage moved all around them, but they saw nothing. Then, shortly before midnight, the electrified perimeter fence erupted in sparks. Monroe strung his gun around and fired. Ross hit the switch for the nightlights, and the camp was bathed in deep red. Did you see it? Monroe said. Did you see what it was? They shook their heads. Nobody had seen anything. Elliot checked his tapes. He had only the harsh rattle of gunfire, and the sounds of sparks, no breathing. The rest of the night passed uneventfully.